Hey, welcome to our final content day this week. I have with me a glass of cold, wonderful water. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But first, this. One thing I love about Jesus is that he is life-changing. And we can use that phrase pretty lightly, life-changing. I heard a friend the other day say that his peanut butter sandwich was life-changing. But in the Gospels, and especially in John, we see that Jesus truly changed people's life. As he interacted with men, women, and even kids, the timeline of their life was not the same after they experienced him. I imagine as they look back over their life at the end of it, many years after Jesus, they would have remembered some of the big events like we would. Maybe a wedding or a funeral, a new job, or graduating, or even winning a big sports game. But all of the things that these people would have experienced, the one thing that must have stood out as a life-changing event would have been meeting Jesus. And oftentimes, what was life-changing was what he said and what he did. We mentioned it yesterday, but let me say it one more time. In the first two content days, we talked about what Jesus did. He provided for the guests when wine ran out. He also cleansed the temple as he refocused the crowd's worship back to God. Then on day 3, we talked about descriptors of Jesus, titles of who he is. Yesterday, the first one that we talked about was rabbi, the Jewish word for teacher. And today we're going to add one more descriptor of Jesus, one more title that tells us who he is. Today we're talking about Jesus being the living water. Now, although this story uses the metaphor of water, John 4 starts off in a place that is far removed from any liquid. It's in the middle of Israel, and it's incredibly hot, and there is sand everywhere. Jesus had been traveling and sends his followers to get some food. Jesus stays back by a lonely well, perhaps to pray or to rest, while his disciples run to a local grocery store. And then out from the city comes a woman. She probably passed the disciples. They most likely would have ignored her. Now, this woman lived in total isolation. Now, right now, you can probably relate to that, what that might have been like, but her isolation was not caused by a sickness or by a disease. No, it was because of some really bad and shameful choices that she made. So here she is, Jesus and this woman. And Jesus asks her a really strange question. It is one of those questions that confuses people that Jesus talks to, but as we see later on, it's actually part of Jesus' bigger plan. Jesus says in verse 7, "Give me a drink." He is Jewish, she is Samaritan. This type of question in general is uncommon. Why would you ask that of me? She replies. And then Jesus gets to the heart of the matter in verse 10. He says in verse 10, "If you knew the gift of God and who was saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." Now again, just like yesterday, this living water is a word picture, and it's a word picture that could be pretty confusing. How can someone be living water? How can water be alive at all? Well, here's the deal. Jesus knows what she's been drinking from. She's been drinking not from the water of obeying God, but from the water of the world. Jesus says to her in verse 18 that she's been married to 5 different guys, and that the one she is with right now is not even her husband. The woman can't deny it. Like we've said, this woman is sinful and shame-filled. But Jesus is offering right here an alternative. She can continue to drink from the water that has filled her with shame, or she can choose to drink from the living water. She can choose to live her life pursuing Jesus instead of her own desires. Now, as the woman left the well that day, we see in verse 27 that the disciples were surprised. Jesus was talking to this Samaritan woman. As the woman left and went back to her hometown, we see later on in verse 37 that she was surprised as well. She came out filled with shame and looking for water. She returned filled with joy because Jesus had loved her in spite of her shame. What she needed more than anything, and honestly guys, what we need more than anything, is to know Jesus. That is who the living water is. Hey, this week we've seen 4 pictures of who Jesus is. First, Jesus is the provider of the wedding feast. Secondly, Jesus is the clearer of the sinful worship at the temple, gets everyone out. Thirdly, Jesus is the rabbi Nicodemus talked to. And then fourthly, Jesus is the living water with the woman at the well. As we wrap up this week, I'd love for you to find an object in your home that represents a part of who Jesus is. You will identify it, you will describe it, connect it, and apply the truth that it represents to your life. And object may be big or small, but whatever it is, you want to be sure to connect it with the truth of what we learn about Jesus. And before we sign off for this week, let's remember one more thing. There is one reason why John took the time to write down all of these stories that we've talked about this week. And actually, it's the same reason why Jesus came in the first place. It is so that everyone, from Jesus' mother and insecure Nicodemus to the woman at the well, and even you and I, would experience his eternal life. That is what Jesus' message is all about. To give us eternal life, life that starts now and lasts for an eternity with him. And it is that life that gives us joy that overflows for an eternity.